When extinction walks aboard a ship already dying, even monsters learn to pray. The walls scream, the air tastes like rust and fear. Every creature here was built to break minds, but his was already gone. So what happens when the thing they worship meets something that worships nothing but the end? The Ishimura-class mining vessel, Hymn of Convergence, drifted through the void like a corpse caught in the current of space itself, its hull pocked with scorch marks and fractures that spiderwebbed across titanium plating meant to withstand asteroid fields and solar radiation. Emergency lighting flickered through portholes in rhythmic patterns that spelled no code, no distress signal, only the random firing of dying electrical systems. Inside its corridors, blood had dried in patterns that followed no logic of gravity or violence, streaked across walls in spirals that suggested motion arrested mid-scream. The air recyclers still functioned, pushing stale oxygen through ventilation shafts where things that had once been human now waited in silence, their twisted forms pressed against grates and corners, listening for the sound of footsteps that would never come. The ship had fallen silent 3 days ago. The marker stood in the cargo hold, a monolithic structure of alien geometry that seemed to drink light from the emergency floods positioned around its base. Red stone carved with symbols that predated human language, that predated human consciousness itself, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat but commanded all of them. Its signal propagated through the ship like a virus of pure thought, rewriting neural pathways, transforming grief into madness and madness into the slavish devotion that preceded transformation. The crew had succumbed in stages. First the engineers, closest to the marker during excavation. Then medical staff, overwhelmed by patients whose symptoms defied categorization. Finally, the security teams, who had put bullets into friends and lovers before turning weapons on themselves or simply waiting for the change to take them. The necromorphs that remained aboard moved through the ship with purpose that transcended hunger, their reconfigured bodies serving as vessels for the marker's will, nodes in a network of flesh and bone that would culminate in convergence, the glorious unification of all matter into a singular divine form. They had been waiting for the final phase to begin when something else arrived. The breach occurred in Section 7, a maintenance corridor adjacent to the secondary cargo bay. No alarms sounded. The hull simply opened, metal peeling back like skin from a wound, revealing not vacuum but a cascade of green energy that burned without heat, that illuminated without casting shadows. The tear hung in space for 3 seconds, a vertical slash in reality itself, and through it stepped a figure clad in armor, the color of dried blood and forest shadows. The Doomslayer entered the Hymn of Convergence without ceremony. His boots struck deck plating with impacts that registered on seismic monitors 3 levels below. The Praetor suit sealed immediately against the thin atmosphere, systems analyzing and cataloging the environment in microseconds. Oxygen composition, gravity specification, electromagnetic interference patterns, trace elements of organic decay. The heads-up display painted targeting reticles across his vision, tracking heat signatures that moved through adjacent corridors with gates that suggested anatomical impossibility. His left hand carried a combat shotgun, double-barreled, fed by shells that cycled through the weapon with mechanical precision. His right hand hung empty, fingers flexing once, tendons creaking inside armored gauntlets. The marker's signal washed over him like radiation. It found purchase in the minds of ordinary humans within seconds, infiltrating thought patterns through the same neural pathways that processed language and memory, using consciousness itself as the vector for infection. It could rewrite identity, could hollow out the self and replace it with visions of unification, could transform love into the desire to tear flesh from bone in the service of something greater. The signal struck the Slayer's mind with the force of a psychic tsunami, carrying with it the accumulated despair of 1,000 dead worlds, the screaming need for convergence that drove the marker's existence. It encountered a mind already consumed by something older. The signal recoiled, not in pain, for the marker felt nothing resembling pain, but in confusion, in the first tremor of something that might have been fear if the marker possessed the capacity for such human weakness. The consciousness it touched was not empty enough to fill, not fragmented enough to rewrite. It was a singularity of purpose so absolute that it left no room for anything else. A hatred so pure, it had burned away everything that was not itself. The marker's whispers, which had driven scientists to suicide and mothers to infanticide, fell on a mind that knew only one truth: rip and tear until it is done. The Slayer moved forward through corridors that had not seen maintenance in weeks. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red and amber, creating shadows that seemed to breathe. The deck beneath his boots was slick with fluids that his suit's analysis systems identified as human in origin, cataloging blood types and cellular degradation rates with the dispassion of pure function. Doors hung open where emergency locks had failed or been forced, revealing rooms where the crew had made their final stands. A recreation area showed overturned tables, arranged as barricades, their surfaces pocked with bullet impacts that had done nothing to stop what came through. A medical bay where examination tables had been repurposed for purposes that inverted their healing function, where bodies lay in pieces that suggested not violence but careful disassembly. He passed through it all without pause. The first necromorph emerged from a ventilation shaft 3 meters ahead, its body a perversion of human anatomy that served function over form. What had once been arms now terminated in blade-like protrusions of calcified bone, sharp enough to pierce hull plating, driven by muscle tissue that had been reinforced and rewired by the marker's influence. Its legs bent backward at new joints, allowing for quadrupedal movement that carried it across walls and ceiling with equal facility. The head had split open like a flower, revealing sensory organs that tracked movement through heat and electrical impulses rather than light. It had been a mining engineer named Torres, father of 2, who had sent a final message to his family before the change took him. None of that remained. The Slayer fired without breaking stride. The shotgun's report in the enclosed space was thunder made solid, a physical force that compressed air and sent pressure waves through ventilation systems 3 sections away. Both barrels discharged in sequence, each shell loaded with pellets designed to maximize kinetic transfer. The necromorph's torso simply ceased to exist, transformed from solid matter into an expanding cloud of tissue and bone fragments that painted the corridor in a stripe of organic debris. The blade arms clattered to deck plating, still twitching with residual nerve impulses. The thing's lower half took 2 more steps before balance failed, and it collapsed, fluids pumping from severed arteries in diminishing pulses. The shotgun ejected smoking shells that rolled across the floor, their casings still glowing with heat. 2 more necromorphs came through doorways on either side, their approach silent despite bulk that suggested masses exceeding 200 kilograms each. These had been security personnel, their transformations incorporating the body armor they had worn in life. Plates of ballistic polymer now fused directly into mutated flesh. The marker had made them into weapons, optimized for close-quarters combat in the ship's confined spaces, their sensory organs attuned to the electromagnetic signatures that all living humans produced. They detected no such signature from the Slayer. His armor's systems operated on principles that predated human engineering, that had been forged in the foundries of a race that had touched divinity before being consumed by the very demons they sought to contain. The Praetor suit registered as dead matter to their enhanced senses, indistinguishable from the ship's hull. By the time they recognized the threat, he was already among them. His left hand swung the shotgun like a club, the weapon's reinforced stock connecting with the first necromorph's skull-split head with enough force to crack vertebrae. The creature's momentum carried it sideways into the bulkhead, where impact with unyielding metal finished what the blow had started, transforming its cranium into splinters that rattled against deck plating. The second necromorph lunged with blade arms extended, seeking to impale him through the center mass. The Slayer sidestepped with precision measured in millimeters, armor servos responding to thoughts faster than conscious command. The blades passed through empty air where his torso had been, their razored edges scoring lines across the bulkhead that glowed briefly with the heat of friction. His right hand closed around the creature's wrist, gauntleted fingers finding purchase between bone protrusions. He pulled, adding the thing's momentum to his own strength. and its arms separated from its body with the sound of tearing canvas, amplified 1,000 times. The limb came free, trailing ribbons of mutated tissue, still flexing with autonomous movement. He drove the severed blade arm through its former owner's chest, punching through reinforced flesh and whatever passed for vital organs, pinning the necromorph to the wall like an insect in a collection. It thrashed for 7 seconds before systems failure claimed it, fluids leaking from the wound in streams that followed gravity toward floor grates. The corpse hung crucified on its own arm, head lolling forward, the flower-like aperture that had replaced its face, closing slowly as residual electrical impulses faded. The Slayer released the limb and continued forward. Engineer Mara Kells watched from Security Station 12, her hands trembling above a console that had not responded to input for 2 days. The monitors showed feeds from cameras scattered throughout the ship, most displaying static or empty corridors, but 3 had captured the Slayer's arrival and subsequent movement through Section 7. She had watched him step through impossible light, had seen the marker's signal fail to claim him, had witnessed violence that turned necromorphs into scattered anatomy with an efficiency that made her earlier prayers for rescue seem naive. She activated the ship's internal recording system, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Engineer Mara Kells, survivor aboard the Hymn of Convergence, timestamp 7419. Unknown entity has boarded the vessel through anomalous means. Subject appears humanoid, approximately 2 meters in height, wearing armor of unknown composition. The necromorphs are not avoiding him. They are hunting him. They are dying. I am documenting this for whoever finds the wreckage." The marker's signal has changed. It is no longer calling us to convergence. It is screaming. She released the recording key and watched the monitors, her eyes tracking the armored figure as he moved deeper into the ship. The Slayer descended through maintenance shafts that had been designed for repair drones, his armor scraping against walls never meant to accommodate human passage. Emergency lighting gave way to complete darkness in the lower sections, forcing his suit's systems to switch to thermal imaging that painted the world in gradients of heat. The ship's ambient temperature hovered at 16 degrees Celsius, kept stable by environmental systems that continued their function despite the absence of crew. But pockets of warmth bloomed throughout the structure, concentrated in areas where necromorphs gathered in clusters, their transformed metabolisms burning hotter than human baseline, sustained by processes that violated thermodynamic principles. The shaft opened into a processing area where ore samples had been analyzed and catalogued. Industrial equipment stood dormant, robotic arms frozen mid-gesture, their programming loops interrupted by the chaos that had consumed the ship. Conveyor systems stretched across the chamber in serpentine patterns, designed to move tons of material with minimal energy expenditure. Overhead, gantries and catwalks created layers of vertical space, platforms where technicians had once monitored operations, now serving as hunting grounds for creatures that moved across walls and ceilings with equal facility. 12 necromorphs occupied the chamber, their bodies arranged in a pattern that suggested intelligence beyond simple predatory instinct. They had distributed themselves across multiple elevations, creating overlapping fields of attack, their sensory organs tracking the same point in space where the Slayer would emerge from the maintenance shaft. The marker had learned from previous encounters, had recognized the threat and adapted its servants accordingly, transforming them from individual hunters into components of a larger tactical entity. The Slayer dropped into the chamber and rolled forward as blade arms carved through the space his head had occupied. He came up firing, the shotgun speaking twice in rapid succession. The first necromorph, positioned directly below the shaft opening, absorbed both shells' center mass and staggered backward, its chest cavity opened wide enough to show the mutated organs within. The second shot took it in what remained of its throat, severing the connection between brain and body, dropping it like a puppet with cut strings. 3 more came from different angles, their approach coordinated with precision that spoke to the marker's direct control, transforming them from individuals into fingers of a single malevolent hand. He met them in the center of the chamber. The first swung both blade arms in a scissoring motion meant to decapitate. The Slayer ducked beneath the attack and drove his armored fist into the creature's midsection with enough force to fold it in half, vertebrae audibly snapping, organs pulping from sudden compression. The second tried to flank him from the left, its bone protrusions seeking the weak points between armor plates. He caught its arm mid-thrust, twisted, and used the leverage to swing the creature into its companion, sending both crashing into a processing console that exploded in sparks and plastic fragments. The third leaped from a catwalk overhead, dropping toward him with all blade arms extended, a living missile of bone and malice. The Slayer sidestepped and clotheslined it mid-descent with his forearm, armor meeting neck with physics that favored neither. The necromorph's momentum translated into rotational force that spun it horizontal before gravity reclaimed it, slamming it into deck plating with an impact that cracked metal and sent tremors through the superstructure. It tried to rise, systems damaged but not destroyed, blade arms scrabbling for purchase. He stomped down on its head, applying the full weight of the Praetor suit and the centuries of rage it contained. Skull and brain matter compressed into deck plating, creating a crater 3 centimeters deep, fluids spreading outward in a crimson halo. The body convulsed once and went still, another node in the marker's network silenced forever. The remaining necromorphs attacked as a unit, coordinating their movements with surgical precision, seeking to overwhelm through synchronized assault. They came from 6 directions simultaneously, blade arms and grasping appendages reaching for joints and seals, probing for weakness in armor that had withstood plasma fire and demonic fury. The Slayer moved through them like a storm incarnate. His left hand swung the shotgun in broad arcs, using the weapon's mass as a bludgeon when firing became impractical, cracking bone protrusions and shattering the calcified armor that had once been human rib cages. His right hand seized limbs and bodies with equal brutality, tearing what it grasped, reducing necromorphs to components that scattered across the chamber. An arm here, a leg there, a torso split lengthwise when simple dismemberment proved insufficient. He moved with economy of motion that suggested perfect awareness of spatial relationships, never putting himself between multiple attackers, always maintaining angles that forced the necromorphs to interfere with each other's approach. Blood painted the chamber in layers, old stains covered by fresh applications, the floor becoming slick with fluids that made footing treacherous for everything except the Slayer, whose armor compensated automatically for changes in traction and balance. A necromorph slipped in the viscera of its fallen companion, and his boot came down on its spine before it could recover, reducing vertebrae to powder, severing the neural connection that animated its mutated form. Another tried to flee, recognizing on some vestigial level that survival required retreat, but his hand closed around what passed for its ankle and swung it overhead in an arc that terminated against a support pillar, painting the structure with organic debris. The last necromorph stood 15 meters away on an elevated catwalk, its flower-head aperture tracking him with sensory organs that saw beyond visible spectrum. It had been designated as observer by the marker's controlling intelligence, meant to survive and relay tactical data about this unprecedented threat. The Slayer raised the shotgun with mechanical precision, sighting along barrels that had fired 10,000 rounds without maintenance, that would fire 10,000 more before requiring attention. The necromorph dove sideways as he fired, showing reaction times that exceeded human capability, but the spread from both barrels covered enough space to catch it mid-leap. Pellets shredded its left side, taking the arm and most of the torso, sending it tumbling over the catwalk railing in a spray of tissue. It hit the floor below and did not move again, the marker's signal extinguished from one more vessel that could no longer serve its purpose. Silence filled the processing chamber, broken only by the ambient hum of environmental systems and the slow drip of fluids from overhead structures where blood had been spattered high enough to defy immediate gravity. The Slayer reloaded the shotgun with practiced efficiency, ejecting spent shells and feeding fresh rounds into chambers that closed with mechanical certainty. 37 necromorphs dead in 17 minutes. The marker's signal shifted, modulating to frequencies that resonated through the ship's superstructure itself, transforming hull plating and support beams into conductors for its psychic broadcast. It had attempted direct control and found a mind impervious to influence. It had coordinated its servants in tactical assault and watched them reduced to components. Now it tried a different approach, one that had broken civilizations and driven entire species into the self-annihilating madness that preceded convergence. It showed him visions of those he had lost. The corridor ahead rippled like water disturbed by stones, reality thinning as the marker projected images directly into the visual centers of the brain, bypassing optical nerves entirely. The Slayer saw Argent Denur in its final days, spires burning under skies torn open by demonic invasion, the sentinel warriors making their last stand against tides of hell that no valor could stem. He saw the betrayer standing before the wraiths, trading the future of his civilization for the promise of resurrection that would never come. He saw Daisy, the rabbit that had been the last connection to a life before rage consumed everything else, her small form broken by demons who killed for the pleasure of ending innocence. The visions carried emotional weight calculated to break spirits, to transform grief into the paralysis that preceded surrender. The Slayer walked through them without slowing, the images shattered like glass against his advance, unable to find purchase in a psyche that had long ago cauterized every wound with fury. The marker tried again, projecting visions of Earth consumed, of humanity twisted into necromorph forms, of convergence spreading across every world he had fought to protect. It showed him failure on a cosmic scale, the inevitability of entropy, the futility of resistance against forces that operated on timescales beyond mortal comprehension. It whispered that he was alone, that he had always been alone, that his rage was nothing but the death throes of a universe that cared nothing for individual suffering. He found a door marked with hazard symbols and tore it from its hinges. The marker's frustration registered as a spike in its broadcast frequency, a modulation that caused lights to flicker throughout the ship, that made surviving crew members cry out in their hiding places as psychic pressure intensified. It had never encountered resistance like this, a consciousness so utterly devoted to a single purpose that nothing else could coexist within it. The signal that had turned lovers into murderers, that had made parents devour children, that had convinced scientists to carve themselves open in the name of understanding, found only an emptiness so complete it might as well have been divine. Engineer Kells felt the change through the neural interface she had been using to monitor ship systems. The marker's usual chorus of whispers, the constant background radiation of promises and threats that accompanied its presence, had become a shriek of something that might have been rage or fear, or both compressed into psychic static. She pulled the interface cable from her temple jack, blood streaming from the connection port, her hands shaking with the after effects of exposure. The monitors showed the Slayer moving through Section 4 now, approaching the main cargo hold where the marker stood in its cradle of alien metal. She activated the recording system again, her voice steady despite the blood running down her neck. The entity has killed everything in its path. 43 necromorphs confirmed destroyed, 0 casualties to the intruder. The marker is escalating. I can feel it changing tactics, throwing everything at this target. Whatever that thing is, it does not respond to psychological warfare. It does not feel fear. I do not think it can. God help us if we have simply traded one form of apocalypse for another. She severed the connection and pulled a plasma cutter from the emergency locker, checking its charge with hands that had steadied through acceptance of probable death. The Slayer reached the primary cargo bay through a maintenance corridor that opened onto a catwalk overlooking the vast space. The chamber stretched 50 meters in every direction, a cube of industrial architecture designed to house mining equipment and processed ore. Emergency floods illuminated the marker from a dozen angles, creating shadows that seemed to radiate outward from its surface, that moved with rhythms unconnected to any physical light source. The monolith stood 3 stories tall, its red stone carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, that suggested meanings beyond the capacity of human consciousness to process. Around its base, necromorphs gathered in numbers that transformed the floor into a carpet of mutated flesh. Hundreds of them, drawn from every section of the ship, assembled into a biomass that pulsed with coordinated movement. They did not attack each other, did not compete for space, simply pressed together in configurations that maximized density while maintaining individual mobility. The marker had called them here for a single purpose: concentrating its forces for an assault calculated to overwhelm through sheer mass. Among them moved larger forms, necromorphs that had achieved secondary transformation, their bodies incorporating the remains of multiple humans into singular entities of enhanced capability. A brute stood 4 meters tall, its body a fusion of 3 separate corpses, muscle tissue braided together into cables of grotesque strength. A tripod skittered across the ceiling, its 3 legs terminating in points sharp enough to pierce hull plating, the infant's corpse that formed its core screaming with lungs that should not have functioned. Lurkers clung to support pillars, their tentacle limbs tracking the Slayer's position with sensory organs that saw in spectrums beyond human perception. The marker pulsed once, a flash of light that carried command encoded in wavelengths that resonated with necromorph neural tissue. Kill. They came as a tide of flesh and bone and murderous purpose, flooding up stairwells and across walls, filling the air with the sound of joints bending in directions anatomy never intended. The Slayer descended from the catwalk, firing the shotgun into the mass below, each discharge creating temporary clearings in the horde that filled immediately with more bodies. He hit the floor in the center of 60 necromorphs, armor servos absorbing impact that would have shattered human legs, already moving before the landing was complete. The shotgun roared continuously, a metronome of destruction that marked time in empty shells and shredded corpses. He fired point blank into a slasher's chest, and the pellets passed through its body to catch the creature behind it, dropping both in a tangle of limbs. A pregnant lurched toward him, its distended abdomen splitting open to release a dozen smaller forms, infant necromorphs the size of cats that swarmed across the floor with needle teeth, seeking soft tissue. His boot came down on 3 at once, reducing them to paste, while the shotgun's stock crushed 2 more against the deck. The pregnant collapsed as he fired into its core, the remaining swarm dying with their host, connected by biological imperatives that transcended death. A brute charged through the horde, sending smaller necromorphs flying with casual swipes of arms, thick as deck support beams. It moved with speed that belied its mass, covering 10 meters in 3 ground-shaking strides. The Slayer sidestepped the initial charge, letting momentum carry 400 kilograms of mutated tissue past him, and unloaded both barrels into the back of its skull. Bone cracked but did not shatter, the brute's reinforced anatomy absorbing damage that would have destroyed lesser necromorphs. It spun with surprising agility, fist swinging in a backhand that could have pulverized concrete. He dropped beneath the blow and drove his armored fist into the creature's knee, targeting the joint where 3 separate femurs had been fused into a single load-bearing structure. The joint inverted with the sound of breaking stone, cartilage and bone failing simultaneously under force that exceeded their structural capacity. The brute toppled sideways, its mass becoming a liability, and he was already moving to capitalize, climbing its falling form, riding it down as boots found purchase on its broad back. The moment before impact, he fired the shotgun directly into the base of its skull, both barrels at contact distance, and the brute's head came apart like a watermelon under a sledgehammer, showering the surrounding area with brain tissue and bone fragments. The corpse hit the deck and he used it as a platform, standing atop the cooling meat while necromorphs pressed in from all sides. The shotgun became an extension of his will, each shot placed with precision that spoke to centuries of combat experience, targeting limbs and sensory organs, creating a perimeter of dysfunctional bodies that hindered the advance of those still capable. A lurker's tentacle whipped toward his head, and he caught it mid-strike, pulling hard enough to drag the creature from its perch, swinging it overhead and down into the deck with enough force to fracture every bone in its body. An enhanced slasher, its blade arms replaced with jagged spikes of calcified bone, came at him from the left flank. He fired the shotgun one-handed, the recoil absorbed by servos that adjusted in real time, and the creature's torso evaporated in a mist of tissue. Another enhanced variant tried the same approach from the right and received the same treatment, its mutated form reduced to a spray of organic matter that painted nearby necromorphs in the remains of their fallen. The tripod descended from above, its infant core shrieking with lungs damaged by transformation, 3 legs stabbing down with points that could punch through armor plate. The Slayer moved backward 2 steps, with timing measured in milliseconds. The tripod's legs striking deck where he had stood, piercing metal with impacts that sent sparks cascading across the floor. He grabbed one leg before it could retract and pulled, applying leverage that transformed the necromorph's own stability into a weapon against it. The leg tore free in his hand, still connected to hydraulic tendons, and he used it like a spear, driving the point through the infant core, silencing its screams as he impaled it to the deck. The tripod thrashed for 5 seconds before its systems failed, legs curling inward like a dying spider. The horde pressed closer, individual necromorphs becoming lost in the mass, transformed into a singular entity of malicious flesh. They climbed over their own dead, using corpses as stepping stones, creating mounds of bodies that brought them closer to their target. The Slayer stood atop the brute's corpse and fired until the shotgun's chambers clicked empty, each discharge buying him seconds of breathing room that he used to reload, fingers moving with automated precision, feeding shells from belt-mounted storage without conscious thought. The marker's signal intensified, pushing beyond the psychological into the physical, manifesting as visible distortions in the air, reality rippling around its monolithic form. It had committed every remaining necromorph aboard the ship to this assault, recognizing that anything less than total obliteration of this threat would result in its own destruction. The entities it controlled had no survival instinct beyond what it provided, no individual will that might hesitate before suicide tactics. They were weapons, ammunition to be expended in the service of a goal that transcended individual existence. Convergence demanded it. A necromorph wave crashed against the Slayer from 3 sides simultaneously, dozens of bodies pressing in with enough combined mass to crush lesser materials. His armor registered pressure on all surfaces, servos straining against weight that measured in tons, systems calculating stress factors and redistributing power to maintain structural integrity. He could not move forward, could not retreat, pinned by sheer biomass that sought to immobilize before dismembering. The Slayer activated the Praetor suit's wrist-mounted flame unit. Fire erupted in a cone that caught the nearest necromorphs and spread through the pressed bodies like divine judgment, turning flesh into fuel, transforming the horde's density into a liability as flames leaped from one creature to the next. The smell of burning tissue filled the cargo bay, acrid smoke rising toward ventilation systems that struggled to compensate for the sudden influx. Necromorphs pulled back from the heat, their transformed bodies still vulnerable to thermal destruction, creating a sphere of clear space around the Slayer that measured 3 meters in diameter. He reloaded the shotgun and resumed killing. The fire spread through the horde in patterns dictated by proximity and fuel concentration, creating pockets of burning necromorphs that staggered through their companions, spreading conflagration with every contact. The marker's signal could not override basic survival responses hardwired into nervous systems that still remembered pain. The coordinated assault fractured into chaos as burning creatures scattered, their movements disrupting the tactical formations the marker had imposed, reducing the horde to a mob of individuals acting on base impulses. The Slayer exploited the confusion with ruthless efficiency. He moved through gaps in the horde, targeting isolated necromorphs, using the shotgun to create corpses that became obstacles for those behind. An enhanced leaper bounded toward him with legs capable of launching it 6 meters in a single jump, and he shot it mid-arc, transforming its leap into an uncontrolled tumble that ended when it crashed into a support pillar hard enough to crack its spine. A pack appeared from behind a cargo container, 3 child-sized necromorphs moving with pack-hunting instincts, and he killed all 3 with a single shot, the spread catching them clustered together. A second brute emerged from the smoke, its body incorporating the remains of security personnel, ballistic armor fused into its hide like scales on some industrial dragon. It charged without hesitation, having learned nothing from its predecessor's fate, driven by the marker's imperative that valued success over survival. The Slayer stood his ground, shotgun leveled, and fired both barrels into its face at a distance of 2 meters. The brute's head snapped backward from the impact but did not rupture, its reinforced skull proving more resistant than anticipated. It backhanded him with a fist the size of a cargo crate. The blow caught him in the chest, lifting him off his feet, sending him tumbling backward through the air. He crashed through a stack of storage containers, titanium buckling around his armored form, kinetic energy transferred through layers of advanced protection. The Praetor suit absorbed most of the impact, servos locking to prevent whiplash, internal systems compensating for the sudden acceleration and deceleration, but damage indicators flickered across his HUD, showing stress fractures in the outer armor layer. The brute charged again, seeking to capitalize while he was grounded. The Slayer rolled aside as it stomped down, its foot cratering the deck where his head had been, metal crumpling like paper under concentrated mass. He came up firing, the shotgun speaking rapid fire, pumping shells into the creature's knee joints with mathematical precision, targeting the structural weak points where bone met bone, where the fusion of multiple skeletons created seams in the reinforced anatomy. The right knee exploded on the third shot, calcified material fragmenting under repeated trauma, and the brute dropped to one side, balance destroyed. He closed the distance before it could recover, driving his armored knee into its face with the full force of his momentum. Bone cracked with the sound of breaking stone, the brute's reinforced skull finally meeting something harder. It reeled backward, sensory organs damaged, and he pressed the shotgun directly against its throat, both barrels aligned with the thick column of vertebrae that carried signals from brain to body. He fired and the connection severed, the brute's massive form going limp, collapsing forward onto the deck with an impact that registered on seismic sensors throughout the ship. The remaining necromorphs pulled back, creating a semicircle around him, their flowerhead apertures tracking his movements, but not advancing. The marker's signal had shifted again, modulating to frequencies that carried new instructions, evaluating tactics that had failed, and formulating approaches not yet attempted. The horde numbered fewer than 100 now, reduced from 300 in less than 15 minutes. The cargo bay floor littered with corpses in various states of dismemberment. The Slayer reloaded and waited, shotgun leveled, sensors tracking heat signatures in the smoke. Engineer Kells watched from the observation deck, her plasma cutter forgotten in nerveless hands. She had witnessed butchery on an industrial scale, had watched the necromorphs reduced from unstoppable force to scattered remnants by a single entity that seemed to operate on principles divorced from human limitation. The cargo bay looked like an abattoir designed by madmen, blood and tissue painting every surface, fire still burning in isolated pockets where flesh provided fuel. And in the center of it all, the armored figure stood unmarked, patient as death itself, waiting for the next wave. The marker pulsed 3 times in rapid succession, each flash increasing in intensity. The necromorphs began to merge, bodies pressed together, flesh flowing like wax, bones puncturing through skin to connect with skeletal structures of neighboring creatures. The marker's signal carried instructions encoded at the cellular level, activating protocols that transcended individual transformation, that allowed for the fusion of multiple entities into singular forms of geometric impossibility, limbs braided together into cables of muscle. Torsos fused at the ribcage, sharing organs, creating creatures with multiple spines, multiple skulls, a dozen blade arms extending from central masses that pulsed with accelerated metabolisms. The amalgamations that emerged from the merging numbered 7, each incorporating between 10 and 20 individual necromorphs into frames that stood 6 meters tall and massed more than a ton. They moved with coordinated precision despite their grotesque forms, each step calculated to maintain balance across limbs that originated from different bodies, different evolutionary adaptations. Eyes clustered along their flanks, providing 360-degree awareness. Blade arms projected from every surface, transforming them into spheres of edged death. The Slayer analyzed the threat in the second it took for the transformations to complete. Structural weak points where fusion had occurred imperfectly, creating seams in the biomass that would fail under sufficient stress. Load-bearing limbs that supported masses beyond their original design, creating bottlenecks in the distributed nervous system. Sensory organ clusters that could be blinded, disrupting the coordination that allowed such massive forms to function. He catalogued vulnerabilities with the same cold efficiency that had seen him through hell itself, reducing cosmic horror to a series of tactical problems requiring brutal solutions. The amalgamations attacked in unison, coordinating their approach with intelligence that spoke to the marker's direct control. The first reached him in 3 thunderous strides, blade arms sweeping in arcs calculated to intersect at his position, creating a cage of cutting edges that would reduce him to pieces regardless of which direction he dodged. He went down instead, dropping flat to the deck, feeling the blades pass centimeters overhead, and rolled between the creature's legs, coming up behind it as momentum carried it forward. The shotgun fired into the back of its primary knee joint, both barrels at contact range, and the leg came apart in an explosion of tissue and bone fragments. The amalgamation collapsed forward, its mass becoming a weapon against itself, crushing 2 smaller necromorphs that had been advancing behind it. The Slayer climbed onto its back before it finished falling, using the elevation to fire into a second amalgamation that had flanked right. Pellets tore through one of its eye clusters, and it staggered blindly, blade arms swinging at empty air, disrupting the coordinated assault. A third amalgamation seized the opportunity, reaching for him with limbs that terminated in grasping appendages designed to crush armor. He fired into the approaching hand and severed 3 fingers, reducing the appendage to a mangled claw. The creature recoiled, and he dropped from the first amalgamation's back, landing in a clear space created by the bodies of the fallen. The first amalgamation, still functional despite the destroyed leg, dragged itself forward with its remaining limbs, blade arms carving furrows in the deck as it pulled its mass toward him. He circled wide, staying beyond its reach, firing methodically into the fusion points where multiple spines had joined, targeting the structural seams. The shotgun spoke 4 times, and the creature's central mass separated into 3 distinct sections, each containing portions of the nervous system but no longer capable of coordinated movement. A 4th amalgamation charged from his left flank, moving with surprising speed despite bulk that should have made it ponderous. Its blade arms stabbed down in a pattern that would have impaled him to the deck, but he twisted aside with minimal movement, letting the blades puncture metal beside him, and grabbed one of the embedded arms before it could retract. He pulled hard, using the creature's own strength against it, and the blade arm tore free from the main body in a spray of fluids. The amalgamation stumbled, balance compromised, and he drove the severed limb through its primary eye cluster, blinding it completely. The thing thrashed in darkness, blade arms flailing without coordination, becoming a hazard to everything in range, including its fellow amalgamations. One of its wild swings caught a companion across the midsection, blade arms punching through fused flesh, creating a wound that leaked fluids in volumes that suggested catastrophic organ damage. The wounded amalgamation collapsed sideways, crushing several smaller necromorphs beneath its bulk, tremors running through its form as systems failed in cascade. The Slayer moved through the chaos with purpose, targeting the amalgamations one by one, using their size against them, forcing them into positions where they hindered each other. He fired the shotgun until its barrels glowed with heat, metal expanding from friction and combustion, the weapon's systems compensating automatically for thermal distortion. Empty shells littered the deck around him, brass casings rolling across floor plates slick with fluids, creating a trail that marked his path through the slaughter. The 5th amalgamation tried to pin him against a cargo container, pressing forward with mass that would crush him through sheer pressure. He waited until it committed fully to the attack, then activated the wrist-mounted flame unit, directing a cone of fire directly into its face cluster. Eyes burst from thermal shock, fluids boiling, and the creature reeled backward, blade arms pawing at its own ruined sensory organs. He followed its retreat, firing into its legs, methodically destroying the limbs that supported its weight, dropping it section by section until it lay immobilized on the deck. 3 amalgamations remained mobile, their movements becoming erratic as the marker's signal fluctuated, disrupted by the destruction of so much biomass. The connection between controlling intelligence and individual servants required functioning nervous tissue, nodes in the network that relayed commands and coordinated responses. With each destroyed necromorph, the network degraded, creating gaps in coverage, introducing lag between command and execution. The 6th amalgamation staggered, its coordination failing, limbs moving out of sync. The Slayer targeted it immediately, recognizing the weakness, pumping shells into its primary support leg. The limb buckled on the third shot, and the amalgamation toppled, its fall arrested partially by a support pillar that it clung to with desperate strength. He approached from its blind side and fired the shotgun into the juncture where 5 separate spines had fused, targeting the nerve cluster that distributed commands to the lower body. The cluster ruptured under the pellet's impact, and the amalgamation's lower half went limp, no longer responding to signals from what passed for its brain. He reloaded and finished it with shells placed methodically through each eye cluster. The 7th amalgamation stood alone now, the sole survivor of the marker's ultimate gambit, its form incorporating 23 individual necromorphs into a frame that pushed the limits of biological stability. It had 13 blade arms, 9 functional legs, 4 distinct spinal columns providing structural support, and sensory organs distributed across its surface in clusters that tracked the Slayer from every angle. The marker poured its full attention into this final servant, optimizing its movements in real time, calculating trajectories and attack vectors with computational precision. It attacked with everything it had. Blade arms came from 6 directions simultaneously, each timed to intersect at microsecond intervals, creating a sphere of cutting edges that collapsed toward a central point. The Slayer moved through gaps between the blades with precision that suggested precognition, armor plates scraping against edges sharp enough to score titanium, servos responding to commands issued before conscious thought. He fired the shotgun one-handed, pellets catching the amalgamation in a knee joint, and the creature stumbled but did not fall, multiple legs compensating for the damaged limb. It pressed the attack, blade arms stabbing down in rapid succession, forcing him to give ground for the first time since entering the cargo bay. Each strike created sparks where metal met metal, the deck beneath their combat scarred with impact craters and score marks. The amalgamation moved with coordination that should have been impossible for something assembled from 24 different nervous systems, each limb responding with split-second timing, presenting an offensive that would have overwhelmed any conventional opponent. The Slayer planted his feet and stopped retreating. A blade arm stabbed toward his chest, and he caught it with his left hand, gauntleted fingers closing around calcified bone, arresting its momentum completely. The amalgamation tried to retract the limb, but found itself held fast, the Slayer's grip exceeding the creature's ability to withdraw. He pulled and the amalgamation stumbled forward, balance compromised by the unexpected resistance. His right fist came up in an uppercut that connected with one of its eye clusters, armor-plated knuckles pulping the sensory organs, leaving the creature partially blinded. He released the blade arm and fired the shotgun into its midsection, targeting the fusion point where 3 separate torsos had merged. The pellets punched through mutated flesh, and the amalgamation's structural integrity failed, its form beginning to separate into constituent parts. It tried to retreat, multiple legs carrying it backward, but he pursued relentlessly, firing with mechanical precision, each shot placed to maximize systemic damage. Spinal columns severed, nerve clusters destroyed, load-bearing limbs reduced to shattered bone. The amalgamation collapsed in stages, losing first its mobility, then its coordination, finally its cohesion as the marker's control could no longer hold the disparate parts together. It came apart like a structure whose supports had been methodically removed, sections of biomass sliding away from each other, revealing the internal architecture of fused organs and shared circulatory systems. The Slayer approached the largest remaining section and fired the shotgun into what served as its primary brain cluster, silencing the last fragment of coordinated consciousness. The cargo bay fell silent except for the crackling of fires still burning among the corpses. 347 necromorphs destroyed. The Slayer stood in the center of the carnage, armor spattered with fluids, shotgun smoking, and turned his attention to the marker itself. The monolith pulsed with light that had shifted from red to something approaching violet, its signal radiating at frequencies that made the air shimmer with psychic pressure. It had thrown everything at him, had escalated from individual hunters to coordinated assaults to amalgamated horrors, and watched each tactic fail against a will that could not be bent or broken. Now it tried the only approach remaining. It attempted to communicate. The signal manifested not as visions or emotional manipulation, but as structured information projected directly into consciousness, bypassing language to convey meaning through pure concept. The marker explained itself in terms meant to transcend human understanding, describing convergence as the ultimate expression of life, the culmination of evolution across countless worlds, the transformation of individual suffering into collective transcendence. It showed him galaxies where convergence had succeeded, where entire civilizations had been unified into singular entities of impossible scale, where consciousness had been elevated beyond the limitations of flesh into something approaching divinity. It offered him apotheosis. Join the convergence, the signal whispered, translated into concepts his mind could process. Become more than rage made flesh. Transcend the cycle of violence that has consumed your existence. Let go of the burden of individual consciousness and merge with something greater, something eternal, something that knows neither pain nor loss, nor the terrible solitude of singular being. The Slayer raised the shotgun and fired both barrels into the marker's base. Pellets ricocheted off the alien stone without leaving marks, the material proving impervious to conventional kinetic force. The marker's signal spiked with something that might have been satisfaction, its message continuing. You cannot destroy me with such crude weapons. I am beyond your reach, beyond your comprehension, carved from materials that predate your species by eons. I offer salvation, and you respond with violence, because violence is all you understand, all you have ever been capable of understanding. The Slayer ejected the spent shells and began reloading. The marker tried again, modulating its approach, searching for the psychological vector that would grant it access to a mind that seemed utterly closed to external influence. It showed him the futility of his crusade, the infinite nature of hell, the impossibility of victory against forces that existed beyond death itself. It reminded him that everything he fought to protect would eventually succumb to entropy, that the universe tended toward chaos regardless of individual resistance, that his rage would ultimately prove meaningless against the heat death that awaited all matter. The Slayer finished reloading and lowered the shotgun. The marker's signal carried a pulse of triumph, interpreting the gesture as the beginning of surrender, the first crack in armor that had proven impervious to all other assaults. But the Slayer was not lowering his weapon in defeat. He was holstering it, clearing his hands for different work. From his back, he drew a weapon that had not been forged on Earth or Mars or any human world. A blade that glowed with energies siphoned from the wraiths themselves, metal folded through dimensions that should not have intersected, edge sharpened on a molecular level by techniques lost when Argent D'Nur fell. The crucible ignited with light that banished shadows from the cargo bay. Red plasma contained in magnetic fields shaped by Maker technology wrapped the blade in energies that could sever molecular bonds, that could cut through materials conventional physics said should be indestructible. The weapon hummed with power drawn from sources that transcended conventional energy systems, burning with fury made manifest, rage given form and function. The Slayer had used it to close the portal to hell, to destroy the Titan that had threatened to consume worlds, to end threats that conventional armaments could not touch. He advanced on the marker with the crucible raised. The signal that had been confident seconds before now carried overtones of something approaching panic. The marker, which had orchestrated the destruction of countless civilizations, which had seeded itself across galaxies as the instrument of transformation, recognized the blade for what it was. Not a weapon of this universe, not something bound by the physical laws it had learned to manipulate. The crucible operated on principles that preceded the markers themselves, technologies developed by races that had achieved apotheosis without requiring the horror of convergence. The Slayer brought the blade down on the marker's base. The crucible bit into alien stone with the sound of reality tearing, plasma edge meeting material that had withstood asteroid impacts and nuclear fire. For a moment, resistance held, the marker's substance proving as durable as promised. Then molecular bonds began to fail, the blade's energies overwhelming the forces that held the stone's structure together. A crack appeared where the crucible had struck, thin as a hair, but spreading with geometric inevitability, branching across the marker's base in patterns that followed natural stress lines. The marker's signal became a scream. Across the ship, the remaining necromorphs collapsed as if strings had been cut, their bodies reverting to simple corpses, animation stolen by the disruption of the signal that had given them purpose. In her hiding place, Engineer Kells felt the constant pressure that had lived in her skull since the marker's excavation suddenly lifted, leaving a silence so profound she wept with relief. The whispers that had promised transcendence and threatened madness simply stopped, leaving her with thoughts that were finally, mercifully her own. The Slayer struck again, the crucible carving a second line perpendicular to the first. More cracks spread from the impact point, the marker's structure beginning to fail in cascade. Light leaked from the fissures, not the red glow it had emitted but something closer to white, pure energy escaping containment, the fundamental forces it had bent to its purpose breaking free. The signal that had dominated the ship's electromagnetic spectrum fractured into static, became noise without meaning, dissipated into random fluctuations that carried no message, no purpose, no consciousness. The third strike split the marker in half. The monolith toppled in two separate sections, each piece crashing to the deck with impacts that registered on seismic monitors 3 levels down. The light that had leaked from cracks became a flood, energy cascading outward in waves that washed over the cargo bay without causing physical damage, but transforming everything they touched. Necromorph corpses disintegrated into ash. Blood evaporated from surfaces. The very air seemed to clean itself, purging the taint that had saturated the ship's atmosphere since the marker's activation. The Slayer stood among the fragments, the crucible still burning in his hand, and watched the light fade. The marker's signal had been silenced permanently. Its consciousness, if it could be called that, extinguished beyond recovery. The fragments that remained would never pulse with that particular malevolence again, would never whisper promises of transcendence or threaten obliteration through forced unity. They were simply stone now, inert, carrying no more threat than any other mineral formation. He deactivated the crucible and returned it to the magnetic clamp on his back. Engineer Kells found him 20 minutes later, navigating through corridors no longer filled with lurking horrors, stepping over corpses that had reverted to simple flesh, mortality restored. She carried the plasma cutter but did not aim it, recognizing on some instinctive level that pointing weapons at this entity would accomplish nothing except potentially antagonizing a force she had no hope of resisting. She stood at the cargo bay entrance and looked out over the slaughter, over the hundreds of bodies, over the shattered fragments of the marker, over the figure in blood-splattered armor who stood motionless in the center of it all. Her voice, when she found it, came out steadier than she expected. "Who are you?" The Slayer did not turn, did not acknowledge the question with any gesture or sound. He stood looking at the marker's fragments, as if confirming they represented no further threat, his stance suggesting patience that could outlast geological time. Kells tried again, stepping into the cargo bay, boots splashing through fluids she tried not to identify. "The marker is destroyed. The necromorphs are dead. You saved us. You saved the ship." Still no response. She circled slowly, staying well back, trying to get a look at his face. But the helmet revealed nothing, its surface reflecting emergency lighting in patterns that suggested depth without showing detail. She lowered the plasma cutter, letting it hang at her side in a gesture meant to convey non-hostility. "At least tell me where you came from, how you got aboard, what you are." The Slayer turned finally, his movement economical, no wasted energy in the gesture. He looked at her through a visor that might as well have been a wall, inscrutable, revealing nothing of intent or purpose or even basic recognition. She met that eyeless gaze and felt the weight of something vast looking back, not malevolent but not kind either, simply present in a way that transcended normal categories of threat or safety. "You do not speak," she said, understanding crystallizing. "You do not explain. You simply act." The Slayer's hand moved to his belt and removed a small device, cylindrical, marked with symbols that resembled nothing in any human language she had studied. He placed it on the deck between them and stepped back, the gesture clear enough in its implication. She approached the device cautiously, kneeling to examine it without touching, her engineering training cataloging details automatically. The symbols glowed with faint luminescence, pulsing in patterns that suggested active systems. Power source unknown, function unknown, origin definitely not human. What is this? The Slayer gestured once toward the marker's fragments, then to the device, then made a pushing motion outward with both hands. Kells frowned, running through interpretations, assembling meaning from minimal data. The device, the marker, expulsion. You want me to jettison the marker fragments? Use this device somehow. The Slayer nodded once, the gesture economical. Why? What will it do? He made the same outward pushing motion, more emphatic this time, then pointed toward the stars visible through the cargo bay's reinforced observation window. Kells followed the gesture, understanding dawning with the slow certainty of logic assembling from sparse clues. It will ensure the marker is destroyed completely. That nothing remains to potentially reactivate or influence rescue crews. You are giving me a way to sterilize the threat. Another single nod. She picked up the device carefully, feeling its weight, solid and real, evidence that the armored figure was not hallucination or stress-induced psychosis. The symbols pulsed against her palm, warm but not uncomfortably so, rhythmic like a heartbeat. How do I activate it? The Slayer touched a symbol on his own gauntlet, and the device in her hand responded, its pulsing, accelerating, additional symbols lighting up in sequence. Instructions, she realized, or at least activation protocol, simple enough that her engineering background could parse the logic. Place near target, initiate sequence, withdraw to safe distance. Standard demolition procedure translated into alien methodology. I understand, she said. I will do this. The Slayer turned away, moving toward the corridor that led back to Section 7, back to wherever he had entered the ship. Kells called after him. Wait. Will you stay? Help us reach the nearest station. There are other survivors scattered throughout the ship. We could use someone like you. He stopped, but did not turn, his silence answer enough. She tried once more, needing something more than just survival, needing meaning to apply to the chaos of the last hour. At least tell me why. Why save us? What do you get from this? The Slayer stood motionless for 3 seconds, then began walking again, his boots ringing on deck, plating with impacts that seemed final. Kells watched him go, the device heavy in her hands, questions multiplying in her mind. But she was alive to ask them, and that was more than anyone aboard the Hymn of Convergence had expected 6 hours ago. She began the work of gathering the marker fragments, using cargo equipment to load the pieces into a container rated for hazardous materials. The device went with them, its purpose clear, even if its mechanics remained mysterious. She would jettison the lot into the nearest star, ensuring that whatever potential remained in the alien stone would be consumed by fusion reactions, sterilized beyond any possibility of recovery. The ship's intercoms crackled to life as other survivors emerged from hiding, voices tentatively calling out, searching for others who had lived through the horror. 8 people answered, scattered across different sections. Their survival, random luck, or clever hiding, or simply being far enough from the marker's influence when the Slayer had destroyed it. Kells coordinated their movements, guiding them toward the cargo bay, beginning the process of assembling survivors into a functional crew. The Slayer reached Section 7 and the tear in reality he had used to board. It hung in space exactly as he had left it, a vertical slash of green energy that illuminated the corridor with light that cast no shadows. His armor's systems confirmed the portal's stability, the connection back to wherever he had come from remaining open. He stepped through without hesitation, the transition instantaneous, and the tear sealed behind him with a sound like distant thunder. The Hymn of Convergence drifted onward through the void, its crew reduced to 8 from an original complement of 200, its halls littered with corpses, its purpose forever altered from mining vessel to tomb ship to something approaching sanctuary. Kells stood in the cargo bay and watched the container with the marker fragments launch through an airlock, maneuvering thrusters firing to send it on a trajectory toward the system's star. The device he had given her activated automatically when it entered the star's corona, releasing energies that consumed the fragments completely, reducing them to constituent atoms that dispersed into the stellar plasma. She filed her report in the ship's log, documenting everything from the moment the Slayer had arrived to his departure, creating a record that would seem like madness to anyone who had not witnessed it. But the evidence remained. 347 necromorph corpses slowly decomposing in corridors throughout the ship, the marker's absence where it had stood in the cargo bay, the 8 survivors who confirmed every detail. This is Engineer Mara Kell's final entry. The entity is gone. The marker is destroyed. We are alive. I do not know what it was or where it came from, but I know what it did. It saved us, not through mercy or compassion or any recognizable human motivation. It saved us because destroying the marker was what it came here to do, and we simply benefited from proximity to its purpose. I do not think it cares whether we live or die. I think it only cares about ending things like the marker, stopping convergence, exterminating threats to existence itself. Whatever it is, wherever it goes next, I pray for the enemies it encounters, because they face something that cannot be bargained with, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be stopped. They face annihilation wearing armor and carrying fury older than human civilization. She closed the log entry and began the work of piloting the damaged ship toward the nearest station, 7 weeks away at best speed. The other survivors helped where they could, repairing systems, cleaning corridors, trying to impose order on chaos. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, they would gather in the cargo bay and look at the empty space where the marker had stood, and remember the armored figure who had walked through hell made manifest and emerged victorious. They called him the Destroyer. They were not wrong. Somewhere in the infinite darkness between stars, in dimensions that intersected with normal space only at specific resonance points, the Slayer walked through corridors that existed in states of simultaneous construction and ruin. The Fortress of Doom drifted through the void, a structure assembled from technologies salvaged across epochs, housing weapons and knowledge gathered from civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning fire. The central chamber held artifacts of power, relics of conquest, trophies taken from entities that had once considered themselves invincible. Vega's consciousness, distributed across quantum processors that operated on principles divorced from classical computing, monitored the Slayer's return with sensors that tracked everything from armor integrity to residual energy signatures. The AI had been companion and tactical support through campaigns that spanned dimensions, had calculated firing solutions and escape vectors for battles that reshaped reality itself. The portal to the Dead Space universe had been Vega's discovery, an anomaly detected by sensors that monitored threats across multiple planes of existence. The marker's signal had propagated beyond its native dimension, leaking through weak points in reality, its psychic pollution detectable by instruments designed to track demonic incursions. Vega had analyzed the threat, calculated its trajectory, and presented the Slayer with coordinates for intervention. Another universe crying out against corruption, another marker silenced. The Slayer removed the Praetor suit piece by piece, the armor disengaging with mechanical precision, each component returning to storage alcoves designed specifically for its maintenance. Damage reports scrolled across holographic displays, cataloging the stress fractures and thermal scoring, the minor impacts and major collisions that had marked the engagement. Automated systems began repairs immediately, nanomachines restructuring damaged sections, restoring integrity to armor that had withstood forces that would have vaporized lesser protection. He stood in the armory, human and vulnerable and utterly unafraid, and selected the next weapon from racks that held instruments of destruction from across creation. The super shotgun called to him, double-barreled, fed by shells that carried more kinetic punch than weapons 3 times its size. He performed maintenance with practiced efficiency, cleaning barrels, checking firing mechanisms, ensuring every component operated at peak performance. Vega's voice emerged from speakers mounted throughout the chamber, its tone precisely modulated to convey information without emotional content. Analysis of the engagement indicates optimal performance within expected parameters. The marker entity proved vulnerable to Crucible-class weaponry as projected. Necromorph threat neutralization achieved with 0 casualties to Allied forces, though the sample size of Allied forces was admittedly minimal. recommend similar intervention protocols for comparable dimensional incursions. The Slayer loaded shells into the super shotgun's ammunition stores, each cartridge clicking into place with satisfying mechanical certainty. Vega continued, displaying tactical data across holographic screens that filled the air with three-dimensional representations of the battle. Sensor analysis detected 3 additional marker signatures in adjacent sectors of that dimension. Probability suggests the dead space universe contains multiple active sites of potential convergence. Query: shall I plot coordinates for systematic elimination of identified threats? The Slayer looked at the screens, at the pulsing markers that represented other ships, other colonies, other populations subjected to the horror he had just extinguished. Each one a potential apocalypse, each one screaming in silence, each one requiring intervention that only he could provide. He had fought across hell itself, had destroyed the icon of sin, had ended the Khan Maker's scheme to harvest humanity. He had done all of it without hesitation, without doubt, because hesitation and doubt were luxuries he had burned away centuries ago. But he was one entity, and the universe was vast. He shook his head once, a gesture Vega interpreted correctly. The AI's response carried no judgment, only acknowledgement of tactical reality. Understood. The probability of successfully eliminating all marker threats across an entire dimensional plane approaches 0 given current resource allocation. However, the destruction of a single marker creates temporal opportunities for native populations to develop countermeasures. The information engineer Kells will disseminate regarding the marker's vulnerability to exotic energy weapons may prove sufficient to shift the balance in that dimension's favor. The Slayer holstered the super shotgun and moved toward the observation deck, a chamber with transparent aluminum walls that provided an unobstructed view of the void. Stars hung in the darkness like distant promises, each one potentially sheltering worlds that struggled against forces they could not comprehend. Hell had taught him that evil was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed, a constant that required eternal opposition. He could not save every world, but he could ensure that some survived. Vega displayed new data, fresh threats detected by the fortress's sensors, dimensional weaknesses where Hell's influence was beginning to breach. A research station on Phobos, where experiments with Argent energy had created unstable portal conditions. A colony in the Outer Rim where excavations had uncovered structures that predated the current galactic civilization. A ship in deep space broadcasting distress signals that carried harmonic frequencies associated with demonic communication protocols. Each one a potential catastrophe, each one requiring his attention. The Slayer selected the research station, recognizing the pattern. Humanity's curiosity intersecting with forces beyond their understanding, scientists playing with energies they could not control, creating breaches that would flood their worlds with demons unless someone intervened. He had seen it before, would see it again, the eternal cycle of intelligence reaching beyond its grasp and requiring salvation through violence. Vega plotted the course, calculating jump coordinates, preparing the fortress's dimensional drive for transition. The Slayer returned to the armory and began donning the Praetor suit, each piece locking into place, systems initializing, sensors coming online. The armor became an extension of his will, metal and polymer and exotic energies, wrapping him in protection that had been purchased with the suffering of Argent Danur, refined through the sacrifice of the Sentinel Guard, perfected in the fires of hell itself. He selected weapons with the same care a surgeon chose scalpels. The super shotgun for close engagement, the ballista for armor penetration, the rocket launcher for area denial, each weapon calibrated, tested, ready for the work that never ended. Vega confirmed readiness across all systems, the fortress prepared for dimensional transition. The jump initiated with a pulse of energy that folded space around the fortress, translating it from one point of existence to another through mathematics that made Einstein's relativity look like basic arithmetic. The void outside the observation windows shifted, stars streaking into lines of light that represented velocities exceeding photonic limits, reality bending around the ship as it moved through dimensions that should not have allowed passage. The Slayer stood in the armory, weapons loaded, armor sealed, and prepared for the next battle in a war that would never end. He did not hope for victory, did not pray for salvation, did not dream of peace. He simply accepted the truth that rage had taught him across eons of slaughter. Evil exists. Courage opposes it. Some must stand eternal. The fortress of doom emerged from dimensional transit above Phobos, its sensors immediately detecting the portal breach that had drawn his attention. Demonic energy signatures flooded across displays, painting a picture of contamination spreading through the research station like cancer through healthy tissue. Scientists had opened a door they could not close, and Hell had answered with enthusiasm. Vega initiated combat protocol, weapons systems arming, teleporter arrays calculating insertion points. The Slayer walked to the transport chamber, boots ringing against deck plating with the steady rhythm of inevitability. The teleporter activated, wrapping him in light that carried neither warmth nor cold, simply transporting matter from one location to another through principles that transcended conventional physics. He materialized in the research station's central laboratory, armor systems adjusting to the lower gravity, sensors cataloging the carnage that decorated walls and ceiling. Bodies lay in poses that suggested terror and agony, their deaths recent enough that blood still pooled on floor panels. Portal energy crackled in the center of the chamber, a tear in reality that vomited demons into humanity's domain. An imp emerged from the portal, skin the color of dried blood, claws sharp enough to rend flesh, eyes burning with malevolence that predated human existence. It saw the Slayer and shrieked with recognition, with hate, with the knowledge that its kind had encountered this entity before and found only extinction. The super shotgun thundered and the imp ceased to exist. More came through the portal, possessed humans shambling forward with bodies twisted by demonic possession, Hell Knights that stood 3 meters tall with muscles like braided cables. They rushed toward him with the fury of hell itself, and he met them with the only response he had ever given: rip and tear until it is done. The research station filled with the sound of combat, weapons discharging, demons dying, the eternal song of destruction that was his existence. He moved through them like a storm, leaving corpses in his wake, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that still remembered being human, he wondered if the cycle would ever end. It would not. He knew it would not. And he had made peace with that truth so long ago that the memory of ever thinking otherwise had faded beyond recovery. There was only this: the armor, the weapons, the demons, the killing, forever and always, until either hell was destroyed or he was, and he had long since stopped caring which came first. The super shotgun roared again. A Hell Knight collapsed, its chest opened wide. The Slayer advanced through the portal, descending into hell itself. Behind him, the research station fell silent, its staff dead, its purpose perverted, another monument to humanity's dangerous curiosity. But the portal would close when he was done, sealed from the other side, another breach contained. Engineer Kells and her 7 companions would continue their journey to safety, never knowing that their salvation had been a brief pause in an eternal crusade. The dead space universe would struggle with its marker infections, some populations surviving, others falling, but the immediate threat to that one ship had been neutralized. And in the infinite darkness between dimensions, in the spaces where reality thinned and horrors waited for opportunities to invade, the Slayer continued his work. Not because he expected gratitude or recognition or reward, not because he believed in victory or hoped for peace, but because rage demanded expression and he was its perfect instrument, refined across eons of slaughter into something that existed for no purpose except the ending of evil. The demons in hell knew his name, whispered it in their own language, a curse and a warning and a prayer for mercy that would never be answered. The Doomslayer, the unchained predator, the Hell Walker who brought extinction to immortal beings. They knew him, and they feared him, and they could not stop him because he was inevitable, patient, eternal in his purpose. And in universes scattered across the multiverse, in dimensions where different laws governed reality, in places where horror wore different faces and evil spoke different languages, threats gathered that would eventually draw his attention. Another marker pulsing with promises of convergence. Another demon incursion threatening innocent populations. another corruption spreading through the foundations of existence itself. He would come to them all eventually, one by one, until it was done.